This car has to be one of the biggest surprises I've seen in recent years in terms of the Malaysian automotive context. Because if you look at it globally, the Volkswagen Touareg exists for customers who may not necessarily be able to afford to get into an Audi, but still need a very large SUV. And so, abroad, this car makes a lot of sense. However, at over 470,000 ringgit, this is 40,000 ringgit more than what you'd spend on a fully loaded, fully spec'd, plug-in hybrid Volvo XC90. And while it is more affordable than a Mercedes-Benz GLE or a BMW X5, it does beg the question whether or not the VW badge has any business being said in the same breath as luxury brands. My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the 2024 Volkswagen Touareg R-Line. Now before we get onto the rest of the car, let's first talk about the powertrain. Underneath this bonnet lies a 3-litre turbocharged V6 producing 340 PS and 450 Newton meters of torque. The 0 to 100 sprint is completed in just 6 seconds and will go on to a top speed of 250 kilometers an hour. So this car is certainly not a slouch. However, the 3-litre straight 6 and mild hybrid pairing that you get in the X5 is more powerful, and so is the 2-litre plug-in hybrid setup that you get from the Volvo XC90, which pulls over 700 Newton meters of torque, which means that this is certainly not the car you buy for brawn either. Perhaps this is a car that you buy out of individuality, because I will give the Touareg props in terms of its design. Now, Volkswagens have generally had a very stoic, very timeless sort of design, and this Touareg certainly carries that torch forwards. Now, it is worth noting that the model that we get is actually a facelift. We never got the pre-facelift version of this car. And so we do get these huge matrix IQ lights up front, which also come with dynamic indicators, a light bar that stretches all the way across the front end, as well as part of that matrix system, adaptive high beams. Now, of the adaptive high beams, I will also mention that they are perhaps one of the most aggressive systems I've ever seen, able to pay attention to a variety of different cars at once, which means that if you are driving out at night, these lights will be very helpful. And if that's not enough, over here lies a night vision camera system, the first such application on a Volkswagen here in Malaysia. I have tested the system and I will say that it can see quite a bit at night, but with these lights you don't really need it. Now, talking about lights, I will note that because this is the R-Line, we get the more aggressive R-Line bumper on the front, which I think does make this car look quite smart, but that also means that we do not get fog lights down here. Instead, we have a bad weather lighting system accessible via a button on the right-hand side of the steering wheel. But talking about that bumper, it does reveal one of the things about this car that I absolutely cannot stand, and that is the visible wiring loom that lives back here, which wires up these front sensors. This, to me, looks like an argument between a designer and an accountant, because the accountants probably said we can save a couple of bucks by just leaving it exposed, as opposed to having it wired discreetly somewhere along the sides of the bumper. Not a good choice. But this is perhaps one of the Touareg's strongest angles, because I think this car looks very handsome and very muscular, and this profile has a lot to do with that. Rolling stock is handled by a set of 20-inch alloy wheels with a silver front face and a black sort of inner wrapped in Bridgestone Alenza tires. Now, these are pretty decent performance tires, enough to handle the weight and the power of this car, and so I think that is a pretty decent choice. Now, moving down the side, you get an R-Line badge there, because obviously you want everyone to know that you got the sportier variant. You get chrome trim around the window line, as well as functional chrome roof rails, which I think really do set off the side of this car quite well. And as is typical of VAG products, you have these very tight crease lines along the bodywork. Again, not only to show the way this car is built and to what exacting degree it's built, but also because it helps to break up the monotony of the side design. I also appreciate the fact that these rear wheel arches are somewhat flared as the glass house tapers toward the rear, which I think again make this car look very good indeed. This is also the fuel filler cap, which you'll be using a lot of with this. The back end of this Touareg is also just as handsome as the rest of it. That sharp belt line actually continues into the tail lights, which also stretch straight across the tailgate, and I think it does look quite nice. Now, speaking of the tail lights, not only do you get that light bar, you also get these sort of differing animated tail lights where you have one set for the positioning lights and one more set for the brake lights, which at least make this car look a little bit more distinctive. You also get scrolling indicators at the rear. Now, because this is an R-line, we get a slightly more pronounced rear spoiler, as well as a set of exhaust exits, replete with a little bit of black cladding along the bottom, again to highlight this car's sportiness. Now, while I do think that the back end of this car is quite handsome, I will note that another thing I don't like about this car is this. Because for this facelift, they've decided that not only should this car come with a light bar, which is very on brand and very much of what cars are doing right now, but that they should also illuminate the badge. It's okay. So behind this powered tailgate, you will find a good amount of space. The Touareg is essentially an E-segment SUV, and because it is only a two-row SUV, you get masses of space back here. Now, not only that, but this car also rides on air suspension, which means that you can lower this back end in order to improve ingress and egress of stuff. From the rear, you also get some space underneath the boot floor, not much, but more importantly, there is also a space saver spare wheel in here, which I will note is perhaps one of the strangest spare wheels I've ever seen. I'm sure it works, it just looks a little funny. Now, aside from that, you get a 12-volt socket. You also get these hinges here, which allow you to fold the rear seats should you want them to. And with these levers, you can fold the rear seats 40, 20, 40 for added practicality, which means that you can fold just the center bit should you want to carry longer items while still maintaining the ability to carry two passengers in the back. I will also note that this parcel shelf is particularly noteworthy because the fact that it lifts out of the way like that means that it's a lot easier to access things at the furthest reaches of the boot, which I hugely appreciate. A lot of cars at this price point either don't bother with this or they just leave you to deal with it yourself. I like that Volkswagen thought of that. That's good. Now, the enormity of the Touareg's exterior does at least translate to enormity in here, because from the moment you set in, you're very quick to realize just how big this car is. There is an expanse of space, despite the fact that German cars are accused of building cockpits that are very snug. This Touareg does buck the trend in the sense that it does feel like you have a lot of room to stretch out and such. Now, being sat here, the first thing that hits you naturally is the technology, because in the middle here you have this absolutely massive screen. I think it measures about 15 inches or something to that effect, and it is huge. On top of that, as you may have caught earlier, it also has your usual gesture controls and so on that you see from Volkswagen, and I will say that it is among the more responsive systems that I've seen from them. I'm suddenly thinking about the Volkswagen Arteon, where this was generally quite useless, but here it does work. Not that I use it, but it works. Now, this screen is not only quick to respond, but the graphics are also pretty good once the system boots up. One of the issues that I've had with this system is that while it does look good and operates very well once it's on, it takes a long time to switch on. I live in a condo, and I park quite high up, and I will say that it takes from the moment of getting into the car all the way down to my gantry gate before this thing actually starts responding properly. And I think that that is quite naff, because if you've paid nearly 500,000 ringgit for a car, you expect slightly better processing than this. But again, once it works very well. Your Android Auto and Apple CarPlay take up the entirety of the screen, leaving only a little ribbon on the bottom to control your air conditioning and climate controls and so on. And if you choose not to use wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, there are also USB ports here that actually connect to the screen, which is what I prefer because my phone likes to heat up if I use wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Now, if this screen is not enough, there is also a massive digital instrument cluster up ahead of me as well, running the same graphics with the same sort of snappiness and the same sort of refresh rate that you saw from the center screen, which means that the overall experience is quite consistent regardless of where your eye is. It just irritates me slightly that this screen, while very customizable, is not complemented by a heads-up display, which we saw from the Mark 8 Golf GTI. Having some display right in your eye line does help, particularly when you're driving very quickly or when you're driving over longer distances and you don't want the fatigue of having to move your eye and also your focus point back and forth. On top of that, I will also note that for some reason, this instrument cluster will not display your navigation settings if you use Android Auto. I point this out because in the Golf GTI, it did. It also displayed on the heads-up display, which we don't have. Weird. Now, beyond that, the ergonomics in this car are very good, as is expected in most Volkswagens. The steering wheel is electrically adjustable, the first I've seen in a Volkswagen here in Malaysia, although I think the last Touareg had it. And of course, you do get 3-stage memory adjustment for the 2 front seats. Now, this is very important because these seats are very customizable. You can adjust the side bolsters down below as well as the side bolsters up here. You have lumbar support, adjustable headrest, you can adjust the tilt angle and so on, again, as you'd expect from a car at this price point. And so being able to customize it to just the way you like it means that it's also very important that you're able to recall those settings very quickly, and those also naturally operate the 2 outside mirrors. Beyond that, all the steering wheel controls are exactly where you expect them to be, and as is the case with most modern Volkswagens, it is a capacitive touch system, which has the obvious benefit of cost to Volkswagen and the obvious deficit of real interaction from the driver. It is surprisingly irritating to have to adjust your follow distance and your speed for the adaptive cruise control through these haptic touch buttons, and it's also very irritating to have to adjust the volume because if you slide it, it moves too much, and if you tap it, it takes a little bit too long, and you have to keep looking to make sure that your finger is exactly where you expect it to be. I do know that Volkswagen is phasing this out, and so I won't give them too much grief, but for the time being, that's annoying. Aside from that, you get this lovely chunky gear selector, which I like a lot. You also get your volume controls, your start-stop button, everything lives down here. You get another USB port here, as well as your 12-volt socket and a Qi wireless charging pad. You get a couple of cup holders, and then back here is where you find a couple of knobs. Now, the one on the left controls your ride height because this car runs on air suspension. And so if you are driving off-road or if you need to traverse something that might be a little bit more challenging, you can actually raise this car quite a bit. On this side, however, we have a selection of drive modes, which include both on and off-road modes. Now, in a media preview drive, which we were not invited to, Volkswagen Passenger Cars Malaysia went through the process and trouble of educating the media on how capable this car is. This car even has a wading depth of up to 550 millimeters, not that anyone's going to be using that, because the powertrain in this car is also mated to a 4-motion all-wheel drive system. I will take this opportunity to say that 4-motion is not quattro. But despite that, this car did prove its mettle off-road, allegedly, and so that is one of this car's main selling points, the fact that you get all-wheel traction. Now, beyond that, practicality is also pretty well sorted. Again, you have a bin here, you got those cup holders here, but you do still get a decently sized glove box, you get decently sized door bins, and so again, everything in here just is quite nice. Now, talking about materials, because naturally this is a car that is pushing on ringgit, and so we have to pay attention to material quality and fit and finish. Now, there are lots of soft touch materials even here on the dash. You get lots of contrast stitching, even on the dash tops and on the sides here. Everything here is nice and soft. Even the plastics that you hold feel very high quality. The steering wheel is wrapped in leather. The seats also have leather with perforations for the heating and ventilation functions. You also get stitching for the R-Line badge here. And again, I think this interior does look and feel quite nice. You also get a customizable ambient lighting system, which I think displays itself quite well, replete with Touareg badging on the left side, and you can customize different colors between the top and lower half of the cabin. However, as I've no doubt you may have noticed from this shot, it is quite dark. And that's because despite costing over 470,000 ringgit, this car does not come with any sort of panoramic or sunroof. Weird. Now, the Volkswagen Touareg is built on the MLB Evo platform, which it shares with vehicles like the Porsche Cayenne, the Audi Q7, as well as the Lamborghini Urus and Bentley Bentayga. Now, the benefit of using that shared platform is that this overall package has been optimized for maximum interior space, which is why, with the front seats at my driving position, I have a huge amount of knee room and a huge amount of headroom. Again, no doubt aided by the fact that there is no panoramic sunroof. And it does mean that if I were to want to use this as a chauffeur car, there is plenty of space for me to cross my legs sitting behind myself should I want to. And of course, because the front passenger seat is also powered, a driver could potentially move that out of the way to make a little bit of extra room. Not that you need it, because in addition to that, the floor is quite low. There's plenty of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me if I was so tall. And of course, life back here is still very comfortable. As you can see, I have very good under thigh support. I have nice comfortable materials all around, which means anywhere I rest my hand or my arm is nice and comfortable. I get B-pillar aircon vents. I get air conditioning vents here in the middle. This car also comes with 4-zone climate control, ensuring that all passengers in the Touareg are nice and comfy. I also get sun blinds here, should I want to block out visibility from the outside, or if you have children, it's another way to keep them safe from harmful UV rays. I have an armrest here with a couple of cup holders. There are naturally ISOFIX mounts on these two seats. There is no ISOFIX mount on the front passenger seat, which is a bit of a shame, but it is what it is. Now, talking about materials, I would like to note that in a lot of Volkswagens, they like to cheap out when you move to the second row of seats. And while that is somewhat present here because you don't get the stitching up here, and of course the materials here are somewhat harder wearing than they are in the front, they are at least soft touch, and so I can forgive it for that much. The ambient lighting system also stretches back here, which is pretty good. And of course, the Dyne audio system that comes as standard with this car is very punchy and very, very crisp. It's not the best in the class because, again, you can get a Bowers & Wilkins audio system in the Volvo XC90 Ultimate, but it does do pretty well. And so if you do want something with a slightly more simple powertrain, then this could be a pretty decent car for you. However, one of the main benefits that people claim to have with these much more mechanical analog vehicles like this, where you don't have any form of electrification, is that it benefits in terms of weight, which then translates into dynamics. And given the fact that the Volkswagen Touareg is offered in Malaysia exclusively as an R-line model, does this car have the dynamic aggression to match the exterior? Well, I understand that the suggestion of a 3-litre V6 up front, 4-motion, all-wheel drive, an 8-speed automatic gearbox and R-line trim might give you the impression that this is a dynamic car to drive, but that's not really the point. And I kind of understand, because if you were to buy an SUV this big, I don't think dynamic flair is really what you're looking for. Besides, within the Volkswagen group, if you wanted a dynamic large SUV, you could get a Porsche Cayenne, which remains one of the best handling SUVs out there, bar none. And if you have more money, I suppose you could get a Lamborghini Urus. But for the Touareg, the focus is very clearly on comfort. That's why in our market, for example, we get air suspension as standard. So I understand that this car has a slightly more comfortable edge to it, and so we'll focus on that. Now, from behind the wheel, you do appreciate this very commanding driving position. The benefit of Volkswagen's design language means that you have excellent visibility all the way around, even though you are piloting something that is ultimately enormous. On top of that, this car's 360-degree cameras mean that when you do have to maneuver this car through tight spaces, you don't really get too nervous. Adding to that sense of ease is this car's variable ratio steering rack, very similar to what we saw in the Golf GTI. But what that lended towards a slightly more engaged, more dynamic driving experience here, it just means that the car is a little bit easier to drive. Turning from lock to lock, for example, is a very easy affair. Now, that aside, we do have to talk about that powertrain, because a 3-litre V6 is certainly nothing to be scoffed at, particularly in this day and age where more and more car makers are looking to downsize. So what are the benefits of having such a large engine? Well, firstly, it's never really that stressed. So when you're moving off from a standstill, for example, the engine remains very smooth, the RPMs remain quite low, and you have this sensation of luxurious effortlessness. You never really have to hurry this car because there is plenty of poke available. And of course, when you do decide to put your foot down, there's also a surprisingly pleasant noise. I do like V6s, I love their smoothness, and I love the sonorous sound that they give you when you do poke it up the backside. But try not to do that too often in this, otherwise your fuel economy starts looking quite grim. Now, of course, one could argue that when you're driving about in town, you don't really need something this powerful, and I agree, a 2-litre 4-cylinder is more than enough. But in reality, For cars like these, the majority of owners will be using them to travel distances. And when you're driving on the motorway, being able to maintain motorway speed in this as effortlessly as it does means that it does make this cabin a very comfortable affair. It means traveling in this is just absolutely pleasant. It's difficult to quite understand unless you've driven them back to back, and so I certainly hope that if you are cross-shopping within this segment that you test drive all of the cars within the price range, because this V6 does make a difference. Sure, one could also argue that the 6-cylinder from BMW's X5 is just as good, and I am inclined to agree. But of course, again, if you don't want to muck about with plugging in your car, etc., then this might be a nicer option for you. But to me, what really gets me about this car is the refinement on offer, or potentially the lack thereof. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car comes in at over 470,000 ringgit when you include the Volkswagen Assurance Package, which gives you a 5-year warranty and service plan. That means that this car is about 40,000 ringgit more expensive than the Volvo XC90, but also about 40 to 50,000 ringgit more affordable than a BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLE. But to call this the value buy wouldn't quite be right, because this car doesn't quite offer what those cars do, especially in terms of refinement. So the Mercedes-Benz GLE, BMW X5 and the Volvo XC90 all benefit from being very, very quiet, even at speed. The Volvo slightly less so, but at no point would I describe any of those cars as being uncomfortable. This Touareg, on the other hand, does leave a little bit to be desired, and I suspect that it has largely been down to the fact that this is ultimately a Volkswagen. As part of the Volkswagen group, there are lots of other brands that sit above and below the Touareg and Volkswagen, and as a result, those cars cannot be too closely matched to this, otherwise you can't justify spending more on a more alluring brand. So at speed, this car does present a little bit of road noise, perhaps a little bit more tire noise than I would have wanted from a vehicle like this. But it's the wind noise that I think is a little bit more noteworthy, because despite the fact that this car has very good sound deadening, nice thick sound deadening material all the way around here, nice thick frames to try and keep the sound out, and when you open and close the windows it makes a nice thud to it as if it's locking into place. The amount of noise that's generated from the wing mirrors, and especially around my ear, is quite noticeable, especially when you're creeping slightly further than motorway speeds, which does mean that to me it feels like something of a compromise. On top of that, the air suspension in this car, while certainly very good at lower speeds, which I think is quite impressive because that's usually where air suspension fails, at higher speeds it doesn't really do much to give this car a lot of body control. You do feel the weight in this, and as you maneuver the car you can also feel that weight shift and the body lean side to side, which again does not really lend much confidence, especially when you're trying to cruise at speed. Malaysia's motorways are a fantastic ribbon of tarmac that goes all the way around the country, but because of our challenging geography, it does mean that we do prefer cars with slightly better body control, and I think that the Touareg doesn't quite do it for me. On top of that, in normal mode, when you're cruising on the motorway, if there are repetitive bumps, for example, like a slightly rippled surface, it does tend to bump around a little bit. Now, in individual mode, you can actually set the comfort level of the suspension, and so you can put it to more comfortable than comfortable as well as more stiff than sport. In more stiff than sport, the body control does improve slightly, but in more comfortable than comfortable, it doesn't quite iron out the bumps as well as, again, the Volvo XC90 or indeed the BMW X5. On top of that, the X5 especially benefits from even better body control, making it a slightly better motorway cruiser. And then there comes to life in town. Now, surprisingly, despite that very large 6-cylinder engine, the Touareg appears to be most comfortable and happiest when you're driving about town. It's a very strange scenario to be in, especially when you're in a car this big, but it does seem that the throttle response and steering wheel inputs, etc., translate to a car that is more comfortable in an urban setting. So again, the visibility in this car is very good, the controls remain quite light and quite comfortable, and so again, it does make driving this car around a bit of a dawdle. On top of that, because of this car's fantastic safety suite, it also means that you can drive with the same degree of confidence in town, which I certainly appreciate. Now, on to safety. We have thankfully been able to refrain from giving Volkswagen Passenger Cars Malaysia grief when it comes to ADAS, because they have comprehensively upgraded their entire lineup of cars to include level 2 semi-autonomy, and this Touareg is no different. Sure, the headlining features are things like the night vision system, as well as the IQ Matrix LED headlights. But to me, the fact that this car comes with adaptive cruise control, with traffic jam assist, AEB, lane centering, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, brake maneuver assist, etc., means that this is again a comprehensively equipped car and exactly what you'd expect when you're spending this kind of money on a new vehicle. It also means that again, when you're driving in town, it makes life very easy, and even when you're cruising on the motorway, the distance judgment and the way it manages the throttle and brake inputs do feel very natural and very comfortable. All things that work to this car's favor. But again, when you look at this car as a whole, to me, it seems a little bit more difficult to justify. Believe me, I am on the side of larger engines. I love V6s, and I will say that the V6 in this car is especially good. It's very, very smooth. And that's what you want, again, from a car that costs about this much money. When you're competing in the luxury segment, excess is the definition of luxury, and this engine does have that luxurious amount of excess that consumers want. It's just that 4-cylinder turbocharged engines, or alternatively plug-in hybrid powertrains, have progressed so much that it does sort of nullify the need for this. Volvo was the very first company to go out there and say that they refuse to make anything more than 2 liters and 4 cylinders in displacement because they say that their engines are good enough. And now in 2024, having recently driven the updated Volvo XC90 with its bigger battery and slightly more refined powertrain, I am inclined to agree. But for people who do a lot of motorway miles, I also understand that plug-in hybrids like the XC90 and indeed even the X5 fail to deliver on the economy promises that they make, because when you're driving at higher speed, you're not really making full use of the battery electric motor. And so if you are covering a lot of motorway miles, then I understand the appeal of a vehicle like the Touareg. And more importantly, this car is significantly more affordable than your next option, which would be the Mercedes-Benz GLE. So I get the appeal in that regard. But I do urge that you consider very carefully how it is that you intend to use these cars. If you're covering motorway miles, if you're the kind of person that is doing long distance trips on a regular basis, then yes, the Volkswagen Touareg may very well appeal to you. The security of 4Motion all-wheel drive, as well as that comprehensive active safety suite, and so on and so forth, all of those things work together to make this a really comprehensive package. And again, it is about 50-ish thousand ringgit more affordable than a Mercedes-Benz GLE. However, if the majority of your time is spent driving about in town and you only occasionally drive out on the motorway, then you may be benefited better by vehicles like the BMW X5 with its 3-litre straight-six able to power that car quite confidently at motorway speed while still retaining plug-in hybrid capability for when you're just potting about in town and running errands and so on. But ultimately, the best large SUV within this sort of price range remains the Volvo XC90, because that powertrain has a far wider breadth of ability than this or indeed anything else in the segment, and it should be plenty punchy enough for urban use. The only time it ever really falters is when you're traveling over longer distances, sustained higher speed over a longer period of time. But ultimately, do I think that the Touareg has a reason to exist? Well, I was very skeptical on arrival, and it goes back to what I said in the opening, where I was very surprised by the arrival of this car on the basis that this segment is already very small and the VW badge doesn't quite carry the same cachet as BMW, Mercedes-Benz or Volvo would. However, I am very glad to see this car, and it's locally assembled at that, because it does underscore the importance of the Malaysian market to Volkswagen Passenger Cars Malaysia and their holding company Porsche Holdings Salzburg, because they clearly understand that our market, being a very mature one, will benefit from having a wider array and options of vehicles to purchase. But on top of that, it also means that we can expect to see more locally assembled vehicles, not just from Volkswagen, but also from other Volkswagen Group brands like Audi in the very near future. So, would I recommend a Touareg? To some extent, yes. I actually quite like this car. I personally appreciate the fact that I'm very rarely going to see another one out on the road. I appreciate that sense of individuality. But again, consider your use cases and figure out whether or not this car is best for you, because there are other options out there for you to consider before you take the plunge. In any case, that has been our review of the 2024 Volkswagen Touareg R line. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.